Welcome to Pathology Central Short Takes, Keloids, out of date. The medical literature really emphasizes a link between African ancestry and keloids. Here are just 4 examples taken from the current medical literature that would be used by medical students, residents, and attendings. I'm going to focus on the first sentence because up to date is supposed to be up to date. When I accessed the website in November of 2021, I found the statement, keloids have been reported in 5 to 16% of individuals of Hispanic and African ancestry. And the reference they cite is a review article by Robles and Berg. In this article, which has no original data, the authors state the incidence of keloids in blacks and Hispanics varies from 4.5 to 16%. So we've already gained 0.5% just in moving from our review article to up to date. So since they have no original data, where do their facts come from? Well, they cite an article by Akash and colleagues, which looked at 12 patients in Turkey who had earlobe keloids, none of whom were of African or Hispanic descent. In their discussion, however, once more the statistic comes up, 4.5 to 16%. So where do they get their information? They get it from these 3 articles, Kunin, Kosman, and Aluwasanmi. Now, Kunin was a medical student in 1964, publishing in the South African Medical Journal. And he states keloids are more common by far in the Negroes, where the Hindus, Malayans, and other colored races also showing a marked predisposition. But there are no data and there are no Hispanics in this particular paper. Now, in the next paper by Kosman, which was a research article, this surgeon looked at patients who came to his clinic and found that about 74% of them were what he would call colored, and 21% were what he called white, and the remaining were other. And I use these terms because those terms do differ with time and region. But the relevant aspect of his particular paper is that this is where we get our 16%, because in his discussion, he refers to 2 published statistics. All right. The first was from an article by Nagley from 1931, which comes from a paper presented at a dermatological meeting in Strasbourg. And Nagley found in a survey of Swiss adults that 13.3% of them had keloids. And at this meeting, as part of the discussion, a fellow named Staub stepped up and he said, I've been in the Congo and I looked at 1,205 Congolese workers, and of them, 16% of them had keloids. So this is part of that publication, but it was not peer-reviewed, and I have not found it anywhere else. But this is where our 16% comes from. And then the final paper comes from Aluwasanmi, who looked at, it was a very nice paper looking at an unselected population in a rural Nigerian town, and found that about 6% of these individuals had keloids. Now let's just stop for a moment here and make a couple of points. One is the 16% that we see in up to date in 2021 comes from a non-peer-reviewed discussion from 1931, so 90 years later. All right, that's where the 16% comes from. The other point, which is much more important in some respects, is that we cannot extrapolate from these small studies, as good as it is to actually have data, these are the only studies that we actually have data. We can't extrapolate from Aluwasanmi's paper in Nigeria, or from what Staub saw in the Congo, or even from what Nagley saw in Switzerland, to populations. Right? We can't use socially defined race and link it to these small studies, because we know that keloids in particular can have a familial predisposition, and so it's not useful to then link that to socially defined race. Now, the link with socially defined race is something that we see again and again. And I'd like to bring this up because I think that this is an illuminating example. It's from 2001, a paper by Brissett and Sherris, in which they state, in a review of 170 cases of keloids from various races, the authors found that keloids were 15 times more likely to occur in darker-skinned individuals. This statistic, 15 times more likely, I found in 4 other articles, including the one that was cited in Up to Date, Robles and Berg. So what did the article actually say? So I pulled that article from 1969, and you can see here, in the selective series, the relatively fair-skinned Chinese appear to be slightly more prone to keloids than the dark-skinned Indians. So the exact opposite of what Brissett is saying. I did the math myself, and it turns out there's about a 2 to 3.5-fold difference between the fair-skinned and the darker-skinned. So not only was the arrow in the wrong direction, but the fold was also wrong. So the math was wrong as well. But this has been propagated through the literature all the way up to an article cited in Up to Date. So what? Why does this matter? So we say that Africans and Hispanics have a higher risk of keloids. Is there some link perhaps to systemic racism? Does it contribute to systemic racism? I will simply say that in my reading this particular article, which came out in 1942, I was looking for research done in the United States. And these researchers found, when they looked at their population and of their 80 cases, that there were only 3 colored patients. So this did not fit the narrative that individuals with dark skin had a higher risk of these disfiguring complications. So they just say, well, there must be a reason. We can easily explain this by the fact that very few colored patients apply for admissions to our skin department, and that white patients are more likely to seek advice and treatment for keloids. So when you see the data and it doesn't say what you want, it doesn't go with your narrative, and you ignore it, I think that is systemic. I also think that there is a negative focus on these keloids and their etiology. So this comes from Keloids from 1953. And in it, he refers to the deeply pigmented, swarthy, oily skin as being more prone to keloid than the light, thin, and dry skin. Now, one only need take a moment to wonder exactly which of these 2 types of skins Dr. Keloids might have. So is any of this even clinically relevant? Well, no. Okay, so first of all, we can say that 13.3% of Swiss adults get keloids and 16% of Congolese minors do. But the difference between 13.3 and 16% surely isn't significant enough to put in every single medical textbook. But the other thing is, you don't need to start thinking about socially defined race when you're trying to figure out if someone might get keloids. And this was stated really nicely in 1980 by an African-American plastic surgeon. And the point is really, you don't need to look at the color of a patient's skin. You look at the actual patient's skin, because we'll have had some sort of skin trauma by the time someone is an adult, and you can just look, is that person going to get a keloid? Now, if it's a child, you may not know. But then you take a really good family history and you say, what do your brothers and sisters have? How about your cousins, your aunts and uncles, your parents, your grandparents? And that will tell you everything you need to know about the genetic background of that individual, right? So here's the advice that I make. Examine the patient, take a family history. Don't focus on socially defined race.